Defense in depth. Have you ever thought about how a weaker army can destroy a stronger invader without engaging him on the front line? Implementing a defense-in-depth strategy is a highly calculated process whose goal is to guide the enemy step by step toward total collapse. In the first stage, the defender fills the outer layers with light forces. The purpose of this formation is not absolute resistance, but to force the attacker to reveal his operational plan and compel him to adopt a battle formation prematurely, so that he expends a large portion of his ammunition and golden time early on. In the second stage, the frontline forces, after delivering the initial blows, according to a pre-designed plan, retreat toward the rear layers, so that by doing this, they deceive the enemy and draw him into a targeted zone. In the third stage, the attacker faces an endless chain of engineered obstacles, such as smart minefields, anti-tank trenches, and successive bunkers, passing each of which drains part of his energy. In the next stage, the attacker's advance speed drops sharply, and due to deep penetration, his support and logistics lines become dangerously stretched and vulnerable to attacks. Then the fourth stage is the moment when the attacker, due to attritional engagements, no longer has any power to advance further. His fuel and ammunition reserves have been depleted, and the morale of his forces has collapsed due to encountering endless defensive layers. This intelligent process causes the enemy at every stage, instead of reaching final victory, to face only a new and refreshed wall that makes him weaker with every step and closer to destruction. Finally, in the fifth and final stage, the defender, who has hidden the main body of his forces in shelters, emerges from the defensive posture and launches a lightning-fast, all-out counterattack against the exhausted and worn enemy to finish the job decisively. Hammer and Anvil. Executing the hammer and anvil strategy requires extraordinarily precise coordination. First, the heavy infantry are tasked with engaging directly with the main body of the enemy army. The goal in this phase is by no means rapid advance or pushing back the enemy, but rather creating a solid and impenetrable defensive barrier that locks the enemy into a face-to-face war of attrition. The anvil must act with such firmness that it convinces the enemy commander to commit all reserves and backup forces to breaking this iron line, so that all of the enemy's attention and power are focused on the opposing point, and he remains unaware of what is happening around him. After the enemy becomes fully engaged with the anvil, the light cavalry, which until then had remained hidden from the enemy's sight, begin a wide circular maneuver from the flanks. The main objective at this stage is to completely outflank the enemy's battle formation and reach a point where no defensive layer or reserve force exists to counter a sudden attack. In the third stage, the hammer force strikes the rear of the enemy front with maximum power. This is exactly the critical moment, where the enemy suddenly realizes he is trapped between two deadly edges. From the front, the hard and impenetrable wall of the anvil prevents any advance, and from behind, the crushing and successive blows of the hammer shatter his structure. In this situation, the enemy is literally compressed between two forces, and any attempt only accelerates his collapse. Ultimately, with all retreat routes completely sealed, a widespread panic spreads among the soldiers. In this phase, the enemy, who no longer has room to maneuver and is under the crushing pressure of the counterforce of hammer and anvil, loses formation discipline and turns into a defenseless mass. This strategy ultimately leads to collective surrender, or the complete slaughter of enemy forces within the narrow space between these two powerful arms, so that not even a single organized unit will succeed in escaping this engineered trap. Defeat in detail. The strategy of defeat in detail allows a smaller army to, through the engineering of time and space, defeat a much larger and better equipped army not in a single all-out battle, but by destroying its units one by one. Large armies, due to their vast size, logistical limitations, and differences in movement speed between infantry and cavalry, rarely move as a single unified mass. They are usually spread across the region in separate columns or dispersed battle groups. In this process, the defender relies on speed of action and concentrates all combat power on the weakest or most isolated part of the enemy army. As a result, at that specific and limited point, numerical and firepower superiority temporarily shifts in favor of the smaller army, and that enemy unit is completely destroyed before other parts of the larger army can react or reach the battlefield. Immediately after this phase ends, the victorious forces move without delay toward the second target, before the enemy can recover from the initial shock and gather its forces for a coordinated counterattack. They deliver a second strike to another section. If the enemy succeeds in merging its scattered units, the advantage of the smaller army is immediately lost. Shock and awe. The process of executing the doctrine of shock and awe begins with establishing absolute information dominance and mastery of knowledge. At this stage, the attacker uses advanced espionage and cyber technologies to identify all dimensions of the enemy's defensive network, and simultaneously, by cutting off the opponent's access to information, places them in a state of strategic blindness, so they lose the ability to correctly perceive their environment. Immediately afterward, the phase of overwhelming power display and simultaneous strikes is carried out, in which a massive volume of precise aerial, naval, and missile fire, in a coordinated manner and at a speed beyond human comprehension, rains down on enemy command centers, communications, and symbols of power, to create a sense of absolute vulnerability at all levels. Next, the process of cognitive and physical paralysis is implemented. In this phase, the primary objective is to eliminate the enemy's ability to respond, so that the opponent's commanders, due to the overwhelming speed of the attacks and the disruption of communications, are no longer able to issue orders, and military forces, amid chaos and fear caused by unmatched firepower, suffer psychological shock. With the collapse of order, the stage of breaking will and psychological surrender arrives, in which the enemy, upon witnessing the vast scale of destruction and the attacker's absolute technological superiority, concludes that any resistance is not only futile but suicidal, and the will to fight even among frontline soldiers disappears. Ultimately, the attacker can, with minimal organized resistance, seize strategic objectives, and before the enemy finds an opportunity to rebuild or adapt, bring the war to a decisive victory. Circumvallation. In this strategy, the attacking army, as soon as it reaches the enemy's fortress or city, begins constructing a continuous wall and defensive fortifications around the target. The purpose of this is to completely cut off the besieged from access to water, food, and messengers, so that the enemy realizes there is no way to escape or launch a raid on the attacker's camp. Immediately after building the first line, military engineers construct a similar wall facing outward and behind their own army, to protect the besieging forces from relief armies that may be sent to rescue the city. In the third stage, the creation of a secure inter-wall zone takes place. In this phase, the attacking army turns the space between these two walls into a circular and fortified garrison, which includes watchtowers, ground traps, and supply depots, so that the attacking forces are positioned in the safest possible location and can simultaneously monitor inward to suppress the besieged and outward to repel reinforcement forces. The next stage is managing a two-front war. This is exactly the phase in which the attacker uses the advantage of its walls, so that despite possibly being numerically surrounded by a larger external army, due to having strong fortifications, they repel their attacks, while at the same time maintaining the pressure of starvation on the inner city. Ultimately, final surrender is achieved through attrition, where the internal enemy, due to complete isolation and depletion of resources, falls to its knees, and the external reinforcement forces, after encountering the solid barrier of the outer wall and failing to breach it, lose hope and abandon the battlefield. Interdiction. In the interdiction strategy, military commanders, instead of focusing on troop positions, identify choke points in the logistical network. These points include key bridges, major road intersections, railway lines, and central fuel depots, whose destruction can disrupt the entire flow of enemy movement. The goal here is to find centers that have the greatest impact on the entire supply chain, immediately using cruise missiles, kamikaze drones, or precision-guided bombs. The identified targets are destroyed. Instead of widespread bombing, only a few meters of a bridge or a railway power station are targeted, so that the route is blocked for days or weeks. By doing this, equipment and ammunition are halted in the rear and do not reach the front line. In the next stage, the attacking army must not allow the enemy to rebuild the destroyed routes or construct alternative roads. At this stage, reconnaissance drones and aerial patrols monitor the ruins around the clock, so that any engineering team or supply convoy attempting to pass or repair is immediately destroyed. Eventually, the supplies in the hands of enemy soldiers run out. Tanks, due to the lack of fuel, turn into immobile pieces of scrap. Artillery falls silent because of ammunition shortages, and soldiers face hunger and medical supply crises. At this stage, the enemy's large army, now lacking the ability to move or defend, is either forced into a humiliating retreat or surrenders without the need for a heavy battle. Swarming. In the swarming strategy, small and mobile units are dispersed across the area in a completely separate and decentralized manner. The goal here is that the enemy cannot detect a large mass on radar. By doing this, the likelihood of being hit by long-range weapons is reduced, and the battlefield becomes completely ambiguous for the defender. Then all dispersed units, using real-time communication systems, converge toward a single target. This attack is not from a single direction, but from multiple angles in a 360-degree manner, so that the defender defender cannot concentrate all of its power on one front. At this moment, the volume of small-scale attacks becomes so great that the enemy's defensive systems and command decision-making become overloaded. In simpler terms, the defender becomes so engaged with numerous small targets that it can no longer determine which strike is more decisive, and as a result loses the ability to respond effectively. Ultimately, after the defensive layers are broken due to the number of strikes, the units deliver the final blow, and immediately to prevent a counterattack, separate again and disappear into the environment, to prepare for the next wave of attack. Air Supremacy. In the air supremacy strategy, the primary objective at first is to blind the enemy's eyes. In this phase, using electronic warfare aircraft to disrupt frequencies and fire anti-radiation missiles towards surface-to-air missile sites, the enemy's air defense network is paralyzed. As long as this defensive umbrella has not been destroyed, no aircraft can safely operate in the enemy's airspace. Immediately, fighter jets enter the battle and destroy any enemy aircraft or interceptors that manage to take off in aerial combat. The goal is for the enemy's air force to suffer such a heavy blow that it can no longer organize any effective air defense, and its pilots become hesitant and fearful of flying. Then bombers and cruise missiles target air bases, runways, hangars, and fuel depots. By physically destroying runways and hangars, even if the enemy still has intact aircraft, it will no longer be possible for them to take off or land, and effectively their air force becomes grounded on the ground. Ultimately, complete superiority is achieved, and friendly fighter jets patrol over enemy territory around the clock, so that any attempt to repair runways or reactivate radar systems is neutralized at the very beginning. With the achievement of this stage, the enemy's sky becomes a safe space for friendly attack aircraft operations, so they can strike ground and logistical targets without concern for aerial threats. Deterrence Theory. The strategy of deterrence is a psychological chess game in which the enemy's mind is considered the main battlefield. At the beginning, the actor must make it completely clear to the rival which actions are unacceptable and will be met with a definite response. Ambiguity at this stage is the most dangerous factor, because if the enemy feels there is a gray zone, it may make a miscalculation. The goal here is to draw an impenetrable boundary in the minds of rival commanders. Then the actor must, by displaying strategic weapons, conducting large-scale military drills and missile tests, prove to the enemy that it possesses the necessary tools to deliver a paralyzing strike. The aim is for the enemy, by seeing military realities, to understand that no defensive shield can keep it safe from retaliation. Deterrence only works when the enemy believes you have the political will to use your power. If the enemy thinks you fear the consequences of war, or that you will not pull the trigger at the decisive moment, deterrence fails. This credibility is usually gained through firm resistance to minor pressures, or by demonstrating full readiness for the worst possible scenario. In the end, the enemy concludes that in the event of an attack, it will either be defeated or pay a cost far greater than the value of its objective. When the rival, in its cost-benefit calculations, concludes that starting a war means suicide or total destruction, deterrence reaches perfection, and peace is maintained through the balance of terror. If you'd like to see more stories like this, make sure to follow the channel and share your suggestions for future videos in the comments section.